Thanks, Melissa. And yeah, man, that was quite the musical journey you took us on from Black Sabbath to Sarah McLachlan. Wow, that was fascinating. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Did anyone have one of these growing up? Yeah, you had some PowerPoint growing up. There we go. Anyone have an ant farm growing up? It was so hard to find a picture of an ant farm. That's a really weird one, actually. I had one of these growing up. I don't know if they're considered unethical now or something. I can't find them anywhere because I want to get one. I had one of these growing up. I have no idea what happened to it, though. It's a weird thing. But my childhood ant farm looked a little something like this. And I remember spending hours watching the ants tunnel away with sort of this rapt curiosity. It totally amazed me that every ant seemed to know exactly what they were doing or what they were supposed to do without any form of direct communication. It wasn't, in fact, until I read Robert Moore's book on trails, where he talks about ant trails, actually, that I began to understand the mystery behind social ants and how they behave and how they act. You see, ants instinctively know what their role is and how to behave, but until recently, no one really understood why. See, collectively, social ants release, so I'm told, what is called pheromones. It's a chemical substance that triggers social responses. It alters the behavior of other ants. And so without any sort of direct communication and unconsciously, these pheromones, this chemical air that ants put off that surrounds an ant colony, it tells every part of the colony how to behave. And when it comes to a social species like ants, something larger than the whole is at work. Something beyond the group controls the actions of both the group individually and as a whole. And it's so fascinating to me. It makes me wonder what kind of outside forces might be at work in humans. Maybe there are some good forces, some neutral forces. Maybe there's also some evil or sinister forces. Consider my lie. On the morning of March 16th, 1968, soldiers from U.S. Army under Task Force Barker moved into a small group of hamlets. You can see it there just to the left of the South China Sea. A small group of hamlets, they're collectively known as My Lai. It's a small area in South Vietnam. And in the Vietnam War, for weeks, the American troops had been tracking the Viet Cong, but they've had very little luck. Viet Cong always seemed to disappear. They would leave behind deadly booby traps, and it had cost American lives, tons of American lives. And so you have this group of American soldiers that's frustrated, they're in tension, and intelligence reports come in that the Viet Cong are currently being housed by villagers of My Lai. And so they embark on this mission, a pretty typical mission of search and destroy. Now, war in itself is surely a great evil, but something even darker seems to have been at work on that day. And it's important to remember all of the troops at this time were very much aware of the Geneva Conventions of War. But what happened on that March day is sort of unthinkable. When Task Force Barker, when they entered the hamlets of My Lai, what they discovered was not a single combatant, not one soldier. None of the Vietnamese that were there were armed. Not a single shot was fired. They only found unarmed women, children, and the elderly. And some of the things that happened next are unclear, but what we do know is that over the course of that morning, this task force systematically and sadistically killed between 500 and 600 unarmed villagers. Again, mostly women, children, and the elderly. And what makes it so interesting is this: only one person tried to stop what was going on. A helicopter pilot in the air, providing cover for them, saw what was going on, landed his helicopter, tried to talk the troops down, but to no avail. So he got back in his helicopter, radioed his superiors, but they didn't seem to care either, so he carried on his way. The number of soldiers directly involved that day is estimated to be around 50, but more than 200 soldiers witnessed the killings and did nothing. In fact, the crime was never reported by anyone there. The only reason it was reported is somebody overheard soldiers from Task Force Barker talking about it and reported it, and an investigation was launched. Now, what's interesting to me is M. Scott Peck, in his book, People of the Lie, Uncovering Human Evil, he tells this story because it's very close to home story for him. He was one of 3 psychologists who was called in to investigate what happened. They wanted to investigate the causes of my lie, why something like this from a psychological perspective would happen. But early in his investigation, they canceled his investigation because they thought revealing the details of what happened there to the public would be too embarrassing for the U.S. Army. And so Peck never got to fully investigate the matter, but from what he had learned early on, what he was suspicious of is that this group had succumbed to some form of group evil. That they were under the influence, you could almost say, of some sort of group sinister pheromone, almost like ants, that there was something sinister in the air, some kind of demonic outside force that influenced and overtook the morality of the individual soldiers. As Peck says this, he says, the natural tendency of any individual or group is to forfeit their ethical judgments to the whole. And whenever that happens, an individual or group, they leave themselves open to the unseen and sinister forces at work. Peck, in describing from his professional psychological opinion what happened there, all he could muster up to say was something evil. Demonic, perhaps. Which brings us to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of the U.S., one of the writers of the Constitution. Very complicated individual. If you read some of his stuff on slavery, it's very complicated stuff. But he was complicated on a number of levels, and what makes him so interesting to me is he created his own Bible. Jefferson he despised the idea of unseen forces, anything that smacked of the superstitious or the supernatural. And so Jefferson, what he did is he literally took a pair of scissors to the New Testament, to the Gospels, and he cut out anything referring to the supernatural. He called his new Bible, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels. And so every reference to something supernatural is cut out. In fact, this is what he wrote to John Adams about his new Bible. He said, there will be found remaining the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. I've performed this operation for my own use by cutting verse by verse out of the printed book and arranging the matter which is as easily distinguishable as diamonds in a dunghill. The result is an octavo of 46 pages of pure and unsophisticated doctrines. Love it. Jefferson had created his own Bible. What was missing was really telling. Jesus' healings? Gone. Jesus' miracles? Gone. Jesus casting out demons? Gone. Satan? Resurrection? Gone. All of it, literally cut out of the Gospels. What remained was a book of moral teachings. Love others. The Beatitudes. Sermon on the Mount. Forgiveness. It's fascinating. You can get yourself a copy of the Jefferson Bible for $5 on Amazon. That might be a nice little gift to pick up for someone. And the interesting thing to me is this. Part of me suspects, especially for those of us who consider ourselves in some way progressive Christians, that we actually wouldn't mind that kind of Bible. With Jefferson, in one respect, there's no question. Jesus' ethical teachings are, in his words, sublime and benevolent. It seems obvious to me. And like we talked about last week, for many of us, we can only carry so much weight in our faith backpacks, right? All of this supernatural stuff is more heavy than we can carry. So it might be wonderful to have a faith that consisted of just good ethics and morals. In fact, let's be honest, we already do this in a lot of ways, right? I know I do. Now, the question for me is this, though. What would be lost if our faith was just a set of good morals and ethics? Would anything actually be lost? What I've come to think over time is that something massive, something very, very important would be lost. In fact, I would submit that to edit Jesus of the supernatural, for lack of a better word, would neuter Jesus in what he was really all about. I mean, notice how the New Testament writers, how they reflect on what Jesus' life and mission was really about. Acts 10, speaking of Jesus. You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil because God was with him. Interesting. Or later on, 1 John, the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's works. Or if you consider the Gospel of Mark, one of the first things Jesus does when he takes office, so to speak, is very interesting. And so you have Jesus arrive on the scene, and he's baptized. That's his inauguration, you could say. And then he announces the arrival of his kingdom. He calls people to follow him, and then his first executive orders when people are in power are very interesting and telling, aren't they? Jesus' first executive order in the Gospel of Mark is what? Cast out a demon. Very first thing he does. Cast out a demon. And then later on, that very same day, that night, we read in Mark chapter 1, that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And here's the thing. If you want to focus on Jesus' moral and ethics, fair enough, but if you really want to wrestle with Jesus and allow the Gospels to speak for themselves, one of the things you cannot escape is that Jesus was an exorcist. Anyone seen the movie The Exorcist? That's not an easy one to get out of your mind, eh? Oh my goodness. Boy, oh boy. It was released in 1973. I wasn't even born then, but in the mid-90s, do you remember that? They re-released it into theaters. And I went to see it. And I'm still scarred from it. I'm so totally afraid. Like when she came downstairs backwards like a spider and her head, I was terrified. Oh my goodness. I was looking for pictures to put in the keynote, and I'm like, just everything about that movie just freaked me out. Something about, demon possession in Hollywood, and It's interesting, though, because in the number of times I've been to Uganda, I've run into a number of people in Uganda who claim to have been demon-possessed and have been liberated, gone through an exorcism. One was a friend of mine, Pastor Robert, and he said he was delivered from 5 demons. And I remember asking him about that whole scenario. He says he doesn't really remember much about it, but one of the things he did remember is that during the exorcism, a woman was thrown clear across the room. And I'm like, I don't know. I just get so skeptical. Because every time you hear about demon possession, right, it feels just so Hollywood, right? People getting thrown across the room. It feels more like a Hollywood movie than it does reality. And so I really struggle. Because what the Gospels seem to make clear is this: the major plot line of Jesus' life was not Jesus in conflict with Rome or religion or power, or simply trying to make us do better things. No, the real plot line of the Gospels is Jesus in conflict with Satan, with evil. And I think that's difficult for contemporary progressive minds to swallow today because it smacks of superstition. It's like, oh, geez, old stories about monsters in the forest again. It's bizarre. It's something beyond the realm of science. But what it also means is this, an uncomfortable thing. If we want to join the movement Jesus was about, that means some kind of acknowledgement of evil, the demonic, Satan. This is so hard for us to get our minds around. N.T. Wright describes how it was hard for the first followers as well. N.T. Wright says this: wherever we look, it appears that Jesus was aware of a great battle in which he was already involved in that would, before too long, reach some kind of climax. This was not, it seems, the battle that his contemporaries, including his own followers, expected him to fight. It wasn't even the same sort of battle, though Jesus used the language of battle to describe it. Indeed, as the Sermon on the Mount seems to indicate, fighting itself in the normal physical sense was precisely what he was not going to do. There was a different kind of battle in the offing, a battle that had already begun. In this battle, it was by no means as clear as those around Jesus would have liked as to who was on which side, or indeed whether sides was the right way to look at things at all. The battle in question was a different sort of thing because it had a different sort of enemy. The battle Jesus was fighting against the Satan. And this is where my mind has real struggles, because I don't know about you, but if I'm going to be involved in some kind of battle, if I'm going to be involved in some kind of movement or resistance, it would be nice to have a concrete enemy, which I think is always the way with humans, right? We like enemies we can name and concretely identify. It's almost a human obsession. We don't mind protesting, resisting, joining the movement. Just tell me who the enemy is. Is it Muslims? Is it the religious right? Is it LGBTQ community? Is it white males with privilege? Is it conservatives? Is it liberals, Republicans, Democrats, rednecks, bleeding heart liberals, pro-life, pro-choice? Who is it? If I'm going to make a placard, if I'm going to carry around a sign, tell me who I'm calling out. And let's be honest, Jesus had no problem calling out people of power. But consider this. Jesus wasn't much of a political activist. I mean, Jesus lived under one of the most brutal and oppressive empires in all of history. And yet he never led a protest against Roman occupation. He never led a march on Rome. He never carried a sign around downtown Jerusalem protesting Roman oppression. Never. I think it's both telling and challenging. And I can imagine some of you might be hearing me right now as commentary on last weekend's Women's March, or the quality of political protests in general. I can assure you this is not that. Those have their places and they're powerful. But what I do think it does is point to what Jesus saw as the real problem, the real challenge, the real battle. And for Jesus, it's hard to escape, but for him, the world wasn't going to be fixed by getting the right people into power or the wrong people out of power. In fact, it's confusing because Jesus didn't seem very interested in any of that. There was a much larger battle he was fighting. Jesus saw himself in direct confrontation with Satan, the demonic, evil forces in our world which influence us, they animate us, they enslave us. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, this was known as Christus Victor, Christ the Victor. Jesus' life wasn't about personal salvation, it was about defeating unseen spiritual forces which hold us in oppression. And I think it's interesting, when we lose track of the devil, we lose track of Jesus' struggle and what it was really about. And I get, this can all start to sound a little bit spooky and superstitious, right? Let me give you an example of what I think this looks like. Let's say you do some work or give money to an organization like IJM, International Justice Mission, phenomenal organization. They do work to free young girls and boys from the hands of sex traffickers. This is good work. We need organizations like this to pressure our governments to put laws into place to make sex trafficking more difficult. But here's the rub. Money, good laws, none of those things have stopped global sex trafficking around the world. And it raises a very difficult question for me. Where does that kind of darkness come from? Why does sex trafficking exist in the first place? Even with laws in place to prevent this, people still find ways to sell young girls and boys for sex. There's something deeper and more sinister about sex trafficking than just the need for better laws. The battle is bigger than that. Or racism. If we've learned something from the last 50 years, I think it's shown us that you can legislate all you want, and let's celebrate legislation against racism, but there's often a disconnect between legislation and its implementation and practice. Ending racism won't happen just through laws. In fact, I was thrilled Obama's final speech in Chicago before he left office, reflecting on the racial tension that exists in America and that he was leaving office with this racial tension. And his words were poignant. He said, laws alone won't be enough. Hearts are going to have to change. You ever met people in life with no regrets? I find them so annoying. I don't understand how people can go through life with no regrets. I don't know if it's because I have kids and they're starting school. I've been thinking more about my elementary school days. 4 names keep popping into my mind that I have regrets about. Raphael, Aaron, Marilyn, Phil. Next slide. Raphael was black, and I grew up with him. And the racism growing up wasn't overt. It was little things like nobody inviting Raphael to their birthday party when you're 8, 9, 10 years old. And it's not something you can kind of legislate against, but I still have regrets about that because I was part of a group of kids that while we didn't perhaps know exactly what we were doing, we excluded. Or Aaron. Aaron, everyone knew he was gay the moment you met him. You just did. Growing up, we knew he was gay, but that didn't stop us from teasing. Teasing, because he was more effeminate than the rest of us boys. And I think back, what was I doing? Or Marilyn, I don't know how to say this easily, but she was ugly. And we teased her. Or Phil. Phil, he had an accident in grade 2 in his pants. And we never let him forget it. Not until we graduated in grade 8. We never let him forget it. And when I look back on my elementary school days, I think, man, I was a little prick. But I'm so ashamed and regret the ways that I treated those kids. I was confessing this to my pastor therapy group that reminded me of a passage in Scripture. Jesus on the cross says to those crucifying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. They reminded me that as kids, sometimes you just don't know what you're doing, right? You don't know what you're doing. You have no idea that you're participating in something systemic. You're just under the influence of something. And I don't like to do a lot of NEXUS Jesus-y moments. I think those could be manipulated and poured on a little thick. I'll say this, when I came back to faith at 23 years old, what I'm convinced of is that Jesus has been and still is changing my heart slowly. It's a slow work. It's a battleground in here. And I think that's what Jesus was all about. Going, yes, we need laws and legislation, but if the battle's going to be won, it's going to be in here. I think Obama picked up on that. It's going to take more than legislation. Hearts have to change. You see, this is what I find so refreshing about Jesus. The battle he was fighting, it was so much bigger and more important than just political battles. And I think Jesus had this keen sense that the real battle was against some sort of sinister force, the devil, whatever you want to call that. The real struggle is there. And the reality in my mind is this: you can't talk about things like bullying or racism or things like the Holocaust or human sex trafficking while at the same time avoiding a conversation around sin and wickedness and how sinister forces, demons, the devil play into those. In my mind, it's naive and it's dangerous. You can't just make laws or get the right people in power. There has to be attention given to the spiritual darkness at work in our world. And here's the thing, understanding, in my mind, Jesus' spiritual warfare battle allows us to locate where the real struggle is, but it does something else for us. It protects us from ourselves. And I think it's this. I believe our refusal to talk about demons is the reason we so often demonize other human beings. What do I mean by that? Well, if there's not a spiritual dynamic at work in the world, if there's not a spiritual dynamic behind the things we call evil, then let's be honest, the battle really is against other human beings. Our battle's against bad people. We, the good people, must silence or take away the power from the bad people. And yet again, Nietzsche's words keep coming to mind. Be careful not to become a monster in order to defeat a monster. Consider these three folks. On your left there, you have Richard Spencer, who through the Trump administration has somehow been given a bit of a microphone. He's a white nationalist, a racist. He said things like, I don't know, I think white people just have something other races don't, like racist stuff. And just this week, a whole thing exploded on the internet because he was giving an interview to CNN and a protester came up and punched him in the face and hard. And it's interesting because if you had asked the progressive movement a year ago if violence was ever okay, they would have said no. The interesting thing to me is right now there's a real debate, a real discussion online about whether it's appropriate to punch racists in the face. It's a real discussion. And there's heated sides. People saying we cannot give them a voice. We must do whatever it takes to silence racists. Or Kathleen Wynne, in the middle there. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan. I was disappointed this week by one of the things she canceled. But here's the thing, what her office revealed this week is the absolute vile things people are saying about her online. Like unspeakable things. Misogynistic things. Homophobic things. Sexist things. The people are labeling at her in some sort of bizarre attempt to not liking her policies have suddenly made it very, very personal. We've talked about Justine Sacco on the right there before. Trip to Africa. She made one tweet before she flew off to South Africa, which said, let me see if I can remember it. Heading to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. And between the 8 hours that she hopped on board her plane, the Twitterverse exploded in a sort of mob mentality. By the time she got off her plane, she was fired from her job. Life completely destroyed because of one really poorly timed joke. And here's the thing for me. It's interesting. The person who punched Richard Spencer in the face thought they were doing the right thing. We cannot, we must not give a voice or stage to someone who's blatantly racist. The people who are saying awful things about Kathleen Wynne, ridiculous, vile names, I'm not sure if they think they're doing the right thing, but they think they're pushing against something that they see as evil. The mob who ganged up on Twitter, on Justine Sacco on Twitter, they thought they were doing the right thing. Racism must be shamed out of existence, and if we do that, perhaps the world will be less cruel and insensitive. But I think this, in a rush to make the world a better place, to make it a more just place, so often I think we make it worse. And today, as Christians, we've lost the idea of spiritual warfare. We've traded it in for political warfare and personal warfare. And when that happens, it becomes very much about flesh and blood. It's about defeating the bad people. And it's this vision of spiritual warfare that I believe prevents us from violence, be it physical violence or psychological violence against human beings. And to me, this is both the brilliance and importance of not cutting out the devil and demonic from Scripture, because what a healthy theology of spiritual warfare does is it saves us from ourselves. It saves us from violence and hatred against other people. And now, more than ever, I think there's a real temptation in these strange times to demonize the bad guys. And today, more often than not, the bad guys are our political opponents. This is a huge problem. If we don't have a spiritual target for our anger, then social justice eventually turns into a political battle against evil human beings. The real evil of this world is that political party, that politician, those people. And it's turned into hostile terrain. I can hardly even stand it. The feud in politics has become a bloody take-all cage match, and in any battle, the first thing to go is what? Truth. And it's gone out the door in the past 10 days. Truth is gone. What matters is winning. And in the turbulent times we are in, the tempest we find ourselves in, it's going to bend us hard towards hatred and fear and revenge and violence, but we cannot break. We cannot break. It will bend us there, but we can't break. Because here's the thing, where a healthy spiritual warfare reality, why it's become so attractive for me is because it's not just about the struggle for justice, it's about the struggle to love. I mean, whenever you think of Jesus, the thing we love most about Jesus, so many of us, is he was so loving. His love for the broken, the rejected, the oppressed, the marginalized. We love that about Jesus. But the love of Jesus should also stop us dead in our tracks, because beyond just loving the poor, we find that Jesus loved the oppressors. He loved the agents of an oppressive empire. Two stories. Jesus in his dealings with Matthew, the tax collector. We have to understand that Matthew was a symbol of economic oppression. He loved him, invited him to dinner, invited him to follow him. Or Jesus, when he heals the Roman centurion's child, Roman centurion, that's a symbol of military oppression. Jesus loves them. I remember talking with someone here at NEXUS, and they said, Jesus' command in the Sermon on the Mount to love even your enemies. They said to me, you know what, that doesn't make sense, because I don't really have any enemies. I thought about that. It's true. I don't think a lot of us feel like we have enemies, but today I think most of us do. We do have enemies. I'll tell you how to spot them. Who are the people that you're no longer willing to talk to? Who are the people you've unfriended on Facebook because you can't stand their political posts? Like, I'm done. I refuse to even see what these people are saying. Oh, we have enemies. Most of the time, though, they're on Facebook. We just block. I can't handle that person. Unfollow so they don't know I've unfriended them. Right? We have enemies. The people you'll no longer talk to or engage with, there's your enemy. But there is also Jesus' words, love your enemies. Oh, really? I think what spiritual warfare does is it's really about the struggle to find room for both justice and anger and love in the same heart. And that just might be one of the most difficult tricks to pull off. What a healthy understanding of spiritual warfare does is it energizes, it heats up our anger at the state of the world. I'm so sick of it. But at the same time, what it does is it lovingly redirects it away from human beings. Nope. Your anger, your righteousness, it should not burn against those people. It redirects it. And I actually think it allows us to sympathize with our enemies. Because what it does is it allows us to recognize that human beings are captive to larger, unseen, strange, sinister forces that trap us in perpetual conflict. I like how N.T. Wright describes this. He says, there is such a thing as a dark force that seems to take over people, movements, and sometimes whole countries. A force, or as it sometimes seems, a set of forces that can make people do things they would never normally do. You might have thought the history of the 20th century would provide plenty of examples of this, but many still choose to resist the conclusion, despite the increasing use in public life of the language of force, economic forces, political forces, peer pressure, so on. What spiritual warfare does is it allows us to see the people we see as fighting against as not intrinsically evil or racist or sexist, but as victims and pawns of larger, unseen, sinister forces. And here's the thing, I don't think we have to get overly spooky about this. All we need to do, I think, is recognize this. There's something unseen, personal, in the world. It can't be located in time or space, but it's a force that's perpetually pulling people into darkness. It's like a lion looking for someone to devour. Forces that enslave us in fear and hate and self-interest. And if we can come to believe that, it allows us a little sympathy for enemies, compassion for others. Because our enemies suddenly turn from people we fight with to fellow captives in need of liberation. And this week, that has been really hard. Murray sent me the prayer to close this morning, and I texted him back and said, I don't know if this morning, when I had printed this off yesterday and then learned about political forces at work, banning refugees, Muslims. I thought, I don't know if this is timely or not. It might be a little too close to home because I sense some anger burning in a lot of people right now. Yet I kept coming back to this. The time we're in, it's going to bend us towards hate. It's going to bend us towards fear. It's going to bend us towards revenge, but we cannot break under that pressure. So I hope that we can go from here with hearts ready to change, hearts open to the slow transforming work of Christ, hearts open to the invading force of love. Let's do a little question time, but I want to do a little plug for next week. Because I don't say this often, so I don't say this lightly, but I believe next week is one of perhaps the most important teaching I'm going to do this entire year. Because I want to talk about how then we make change in the world. And I'm kind of fired up about next week. So I know at NEXUS we kind of like, hey, come whenever you want. If you make it to only, see, I'm talking to you, you're already here. I should be talking to people who aren't here. If you make it to one service this whole year, I hope that it might be next week. So I won't do a plug every week. It feels so self-aggrandizing. Come listen to me speak next week. It's going to be good. But I think it's important. So that's where we're going to go next week. And I'm going to ask Murray to get ready to come up and pray here. Any questions, though?
It was interesting this week because Brad sends me his teachings and then I write a prayer based on the teachings. And when I sent it back to him this week, I said, I really think you should look at this one because I'm not sure I got it right. But what I discovered was that when someone is really horrible and kind of confronts me in my life, I don't actually want to think about the influences that got them to where they were, whether they're in their background or whether they're sinister. I would just rather hate. The last 10 days has let me focus at least on one person, and I'm thinking, well, I really have to work on that. So this prayer is as much for me as anybody else. So let's pray again. It will be up on the screen. God, we are tempted to only see what is obvious, only what makes sense, literally or actually. And there are so many issues to address and demand our energy. They are good and worthy issues you care about, issues you and we want changed. We know from experience that protests, rules, laws, and morality do not accomplish the kind of changes we really want to see in the world. Legislation so often identifies a noble cause, but somehow it never changes hearts. Laws and morality, rules and legalisms identify directions we and even you want to go, but they are not vehicles of true change. We wish to change people and the world en masse. You want to change us one person at a time. We want to legislate. You want to teach us to grow and flourish as we draw nearer to you. We wish to attain power. You want to address the powers that defeat us. We see people to hate. You see what causes hate. We see people. You see powers. We see hate. You see love. And God, we really know that none of us escape the forces of darkness. The forces of darkness align all people as targets of the sinister. God, help us to direct our anger towards the forces of darkness and our love towards our enemies and ourselves. Amen. Go in peace.